Okay, well, welcome back to class. Last week, just a short recap of what we covered last week, we started to discuss the biblical support for hydroplate theory and the starting assumptions. And the main starting assumption of hydroplate theory, of course, is that when the Earth is created, there's a arrangement of surface water, an expanse, or the Hebrew term raqia, and then there's water below that expanse, and then there's, and this expanse would be a granite crust, basically, on the Earth. Then they've got the lower water, subterranean water chambers, and then below that you've got the Earth's mantle. So this is kind of the starting assumption of the hydroplate theory. And of course, we started to talk about that as being recorded in Genesis chapter 1, verse 6 through 8, where God states first that he's about to create this arrangement. And then he actually records it happening. And then he records that he names the raqia, the Hebrew word shemayim, which we're going to discuss a little bit more. It's kind of a mysterious thing to say here, but we'll go through this and try to discover exactly what's meant by that. And of course, the key word is raqia, which has been translated in a number of different translations as either firmament, expanse, or vault, or in some translations, as we looked at last week, they even translated as sky, which I think is an incorrect translation, or a legion of the wrong beliefs on what's going on there. So we looked into this word, found that the root word for raqia is raqia, and that's a word that is described as being to spread out or to beat out or hammer something out, as if somebody would do if they were going to plate an object. Like they plate an idol, let's say with gold, they would raqia the gold into thin sheets so they could plate the idol. So by studying this root word of this meaning, I think we can start to see the original meaning would be more likely to be some kind of a pressed out solid between the waters, where the layers of water is described. I think what's happening in Genesis 1, 6 through 8. And we'll get a little more into this today as well. Then, of course, we read in the Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 passage, it records that the bursting forth of the fountains of the great springs of the great deep, happen, opening up the floodgates of the heavens. So we also discussed that rain alone could not cover the earth, the pre-flood earth, enough to cover the highest mountains. So there had to be another source of water to do that. And we'll go through some other passages as well the next week or two that tell us where this water actually came from and what it was really for. We also discussed that in Genesis chapter 1, this term raqia is used 9 times. 4 times it's used in Genesis 1, 6 through 8 passage, where it's describing the creation of this expanse with the water above and water below. And then the 5th usage is the naming of that. God actually names what this raqia is. He names it shemayim. And then the last 4 uses come actually on day 4. So they're completely different context, where the phrase of the heavens is added to the term raqia. And this occurs during day 4 when the sun, the moon, and the stars and the planets are created. And so the context of this is completely different. So this indicates that this word means something completely different when the of the heavens is added to that. So we say the sun, the moon, and the stars, God puts these heavenly bodies firmly in place in the heavens. So I think that kind of refers back to this term raqia. So for example, the earth is held firmly in place as it orbits the sun, and the moon is firmly in place as it orbits the earth. And the stars are likewise held firmly in place in the heavens. They don't move relative to each other. So we see that this and all the other planets in our solar system are held in place around the sun due to the forces of gravity. So unfortunately, last week, however, we got close to the end of the class and the video camera ran out of memory. So we missed a couple of slides here that didn't make it onto the recording from last week. So I'm going to pick up here, this is where the recording ran out last week. So you'll see maybe a little bit of repetition here, but I wanted to all get into the class. So we were talking about here about the first 4 and second 4 uses and the middle 5th usage of raqia. So I want to concentrate just a little bit on this here. So Genesis 1:8 states, and God called or named the expanse heaven, or the Hebrew term here is Shemayim. So here's the two possible interpretations of that. The expanse meant the atmosphere or outer space. And this is most likely the most commonly accepted interpretation of this passage. And due to our modern understanding of the word firmament, this would be naturally how most of us would interpret that meaning. And we'll talk about firmament a little later in this class as well, where that term came from. Also, when most of us think of the word heaven, it would naturally lead them to think of what is termed the present heaven. So the present heaven is the intermediate state of heaven that is distinctly separate from the pre-fall heaven and the end of Revelation, where we see that everything is restored. So we basically will talk a bit more about this too, is that there's basically like three sections of history here. We have paradise or heaven before the fall. We have the present state, where we describe what heaven is now. We have a future state of what would heaven be when the restoration happens in Revelation chapter 21. So the second possible meaning would be that the expanse meant heaven, or the place where God dwelt, or the original paradise. So we'll recall by looking back at Genesis that in chapter 3, God walked and talked with Adam. This happens in Genesis 3, 8, and 9. So in this interpretation, heaven was originally basically on the earth. This was pre-flood. This would have been thought of as paradise, as heaven. Again, we'll get a little bit deeper into this today as well. So it would be the earth's crust. So this description of naming this earth's crust heaven or paradise seems to fit if this is the correct understanding of this passage. So we want to weigh these two choices of this interpretation, and this does raise a number of scientific questions as we start to do this. So if heaven meant atmosphere or outer space, then the Septuagint and the Vulgate translators incorrectly associated a solidness with it. So they felt there was a solidness to this when the Septuagint and the Vulgate were translated, which are translations of the Bible. So notice the similarities of raqia with bakia and raqia support this second interpretation. If the raqia, or expansive firmament, always meant outer space or the atmosphere, we raise a number of questions, and some textual contradictions start to arise. So there's a first question here is, why was the word raqia followed by the phrase of the heavens in Genesis 1, 14, 15, 17, and 20? Of course, this happens on day 4 when the sun, the moon, and the stars and heavenly bodies are created. If the usage of raqia in verses 6 through 8 were to mean the atmosphere or outer space, why would verses 14, 15, 17, and 20 also link this with the concept of the atmosphere or sky or space? Basically, it's, in effect, those passages would read heaven of the heavens, which is kind of repeats the same thing. Doesn't seem to make sense to look at it that way. Question 2 is, if raqia implies a canopy, in other words, water above an atmosphere, why wasn't one of the 3 Hebrew words that clearly means canopy used? So we briefly mentioned vapor canopy theory earlier, and I want to go into that a little bit more today. It's now a largely discredited model. It's one of the 3 flood models that we see today, which is basically vapor canopy theory, catastrophic plate tectonics, and I will get into that as well, and then also the hydroplate theory, which we're talking about here as well. So vapor canopy theory now is largely been discredited as it was originally developed as a source of the flood waters that covers the earth during the biblical flood of Noah. So since this vapor canopy theory is one of these 3 flood models, I want to take a look at this a little bit deeper so we can see why it's not a viable flood model, either scientifically or scripturally. So, and the vapor canopy theory has been also attacked by critics of the Bible, stating that it's not scientifically accurate. And so they say, okay, you Christians believe this isn't scientifically accurate, so we're going to attack you on this. See, the Bible isn't credible because it's not scientifically accurate, right? So this is the way these people think. So it's very important to understand that vapor canopy theory isn't a viable model. So again, the Bible's been attacked pretty relentlessly by the non-believers. I mean, there's no question about it. And a lot of times they will go to Genesis, especially the creation event in Genesis 1 and chapter 2, and they'll attack that. And you're thinking, hey, we can attack the foundation of this, and if this foundation doesn't hold up, then the entire Bible is basically doesn't hold up. So this is how important this really is. So in this passage describes, of course, Genesis 1, 6 through 8, during God's original creation, that the waters were created in verse 2, in verse 2, on day 1, the waters were created, and then they were separated and divided from each other on day 2, and there's an expanse between these waters, and of course this is translated as firmament or vault or sky, depending on your translation. So the ancient Hebrews then were led to believe that the Old Testament cosmos was created, that the waters were above this expanse, being in the heavens, and that there was some kind of a solid dome above the earth with the stars, moon, and sun embedded in this dome. And this picture kind of illustrates that. This is kind of a drawing of how the early ancient Hebrews kind of believed that this was the arrangement. So, and some of the critics of the Bible point out that the ancient Hebrews believed that there was some sort of dome or vault over the sky, and of course that's not what's observed when you look at the arrangement of the universe today. They claim that because of this, the Bible contains scientific errors, right? So does the Bible actually teach scientifically erroneous concepts? As we'll see, the Bible doesn't teach this. However, this misunderstanding of this passage by ancient peoples has led to the criticisms of the Bible that we see. And like most ancient peoples, the Hebrews believed that the sky was a solid dome with the sun, the moon, and the stars embedded in it. And according to the Jewish encyclopedia, the Hebrews regarded the earth as a plain or hill figured like a hemisphere swimming on water. Over this is arched the solid vault of heaven. To this vault are fastened the lights, the stars. And so slight is this elevation that the birds may rise to it and fly across its expanse. So we see that when the birds are created, they seem to fly across the expanse of the heavens. However, these ancient cultures got it wrong. Just as the ancient Hebrews and Egyptians had a vague recollection of the flood, they didn't have it quite right because they heard the creation account was passed down from generation to generation back through their ancestors all the way back to Noah, and they then came to think that there was some kind of a solid dome above the earth, or this word, what we'll talk about, is firmament. This picture you've probably seen before. It's called the Flammarion engraving, and it's a wood carving or wood engraving by an unknown artist. It was named because it was first documented in an 1888 book called The Atmosphere, Popular Meteorology. And it's been used to represent a supposedly medieval cosmology, including a flat earth bounded by a solid and opaque sky or firmament. It also has a metaphorical illustration of either the scientific or the mystical quest for knowledge. So here we see this guy here is kind of trying to go through to get this, hey, what's beyond this? He's trying to find out, what's beyond this dome. So this engraving depicts a man clothed in a long robe, carrying a staff, who kneels down and passes his head and shoulders and right arm through a gap in the star-studded sky, and discovering a marvelous realm of things beyond this dome. He sees a realm of circling clouds and fires and suns beyond the heavens. And so the missionary of the Middle Ages tells that he had found a point where the sky and the earth touch. Thus, the Bible critics say that the word firmament reflects an idea of this firmness, and thus reflects an erroneous cosmology. There's no solid dome up in the atmosphere above the earth, right? So they misunderstood what this meant. So the Bible, they say, you don't have to look any further on the Bible because we can see that verse 6 is false. We can see that, there's not a dome. These people thought there was a dome there, and there isn't. So these critics say, hey, this isn't the inspired word of God. This gets this wrong. Why would we trust anything else? That's, again, the way that they would think. And I kind of think the same way. If we find errors in the Bible, if we've correctly translated, we really understand these words, well then, yeah, probably the word of God should get rejected. If it's not true, right? But we see that it is. Every time I look deeply into anything scientifically, it holds up perfectly. So it increases my faith and my trust in God and what he's telling us in Scripture. So they misunderstood raqia to mean something over our heads and not under our feet. So we'll see as we look deeper into this passage, maybe we just haven't understood the correct meanings of these words. So moving forward in time, we now see that these types of interpretations have contributed to the formation of what is called the Vapor Canopy Theory. So if you ask any evangelical pastor or churchgoer older than maybe 40 or 50 about the scientific theories for Noah's flood, it's probably a good chance he or she will mention the Vapor Canopy Theory. And so this started basically with a 1961 publication of a couple books. One was the Genesis Record, and one was called the Genesis Flood. And these were written by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. And after the publication of these books, the Vapor Canopy Theory quickly became the accepted flood explanation among those who believed in the Bible. So the original theory actually came from, and it was first proposed in 1874 by a Quaker school teacher named Isaac Newton Vail. He lived from 1840 to 1912. And the original theory proposed that there were ring-like canopies of water vapor formed in the atmosphere above the Earth millions of years ago as the Earth evolved from a molten state. Now, Vail hypothesized that these water canopies collapsed catastrophically upon the Earth, one by one, producing torrential rainfall, creating the fossil record. And supposedly this is the Genesis, where the waters come from for the Genesis flood. Vail supported his case primarily with ancient flood accounts, including Babylonian mythology and the Bible, which he also considered to be mythical. So it was kind of interesting. He was looking for an answer for where this flood waters would come from, but he wasn't a believer in the Bible. He thought it was all mythology. So this led then to Henry Morris, as we mentioned earlier in the class. He was widely and is rightly considered to be the founder of the current creation science movement of modern day. So he started his work in the mid-1940s when he realized there were serious issues with evolutionary theory. Not just that it wasn't consistent with the Bible, because it isn't, but also that there were serious scientific problems with evolutionary theory. And his research led to a belief in the scriptures, which led him to believe that there seems to be an atmospheric source of water that was entirely a different type in order of anything that exists now. So believing Vapor Canopy Theory to be accurate and biblically and scientifically accurate, he promoted the Vapor Canopy Theory as the most probable source of these global waters that flooded the Earth. So he promoted this. Again, a number of supporting factors were revealed in his two books, The Genesis Flood, which is published in 1961, and then a subsequent book called The Genesis Record from 1976. And then he also proposed that it was a scientific explanation not only for the floodwaters, but the apparent warmer climate, and lusher environments, and longer lifespans that was part of the pre-flood Earth. So despite increasing awareness of Vapor Canopy's many scientific problems, it remained the prominent explanation for Noah's flood for many decades, and probably that was out of a respect for Morris to a certain extent. But I think many Christians still believe Vapor Canopy is possibly a viable alternative. So it fell out of favor with the creation science community years ago. Biblically, when Vapor Canopy speaks of the rainfall, the windows of the heavens, it's silent about the bursting forth of the fountains of the great deep. It doesn't address that at all. It just talks about this vapor canopy. And vapor canopy theory adherents maintain that the Hebrew word raqia, which is translated as expanse or firmament in Genesis, is a description of this vapor canopy. And I think that this word, in context, when we think about, again, the root word for raqia being raqqa, at that time more correctly indicates a solid granite crust with waters above that and waters below that. That happened during day 2 of creation, as we've been discussing here. So let's look just briefly at a couple of the scientific problems with vapor canopy theory. The scientific objections to vapor canopy are actually numerous. We're going to touch on a couple of them. First, all canopy theories and some other flood theories as well have what is referred to as a heat problem. So you probably observed that it takes a bit of time over high heat to boil a pot of water, right? You put water on a pot and you put it on heat. It takes a little time for that to come to a boil. This is because the liquid water must absorb a lot of energy in order to turn the water to steam or water vapor. And then when you condense the steam, which is the process of turning water vapor back into liquid water, when the temperature of the vapor decreases, the same amount of energy is released into the environment that it's in the form of heat. So simple calculations show that the condensation of a vapor canopy of this sufficient size to produce the rainfall described in Genesis would have raised the temperatures below the canopy quickly, and it would have been enough to raise the temperatures so high that it would cook everything on the earth, and we wouldn't be here discussing this. So this doesn't seem to be a viable alternative here. So we see again, heat goes in, but it raises the temperatures too high, creates a thermal blanket around the earth. We also see something called a greenhouse effect. So all atmospheric gases in our atmosphere, to a varying degree, act like what we see what happens in a greenhouse. So of course everybody's familiar probably with a greenhouse. It's a building that's typically made of glass. It has glass walls and glass ceilings, and the reason for that is that it allows sunlight to enter into the building, and it traps the heat inside, allowing this heat to create a warmer climate inside, helps farmers extend growing seasons by extending the time plants will be protected from colder climates, which would slow plant growth. So we've also experienced the greenhouse effect ourselves, right? And the most obvious example of this being closed windows in your car, right? So living in Arizona, and we were all familiar with this, right? With this problem. When you lock your car and you leave it out in the sun, and then you come back a little later, what happens? The inside of the car is like a furnace, right? The inside of a car left out in the sun can reach 160 degrees or more. I mean, this is an amazing amount of heat. So even if the outside temperature is 100 or 110, I know it sounds crazy to some people that it gets that hot here, but it does. The inside will go much hotter than that. So this occurs because the sunlight can pass through the glass more readily than the heat can radiate back out of your car, so the interior temperature rises. And many are not aware that the atmospheric water vapor is Earth's most abundant and significant greenhouse gas. And for this reason, a vapor canopy as proposed by vapor canopy theory would render the Earth's surface far too hot to be habitable by humans, and in fact it would destroy all life here on Earth. And 3 feet of rain, even 3 feet would do this. 3 feet of this vapor canopy theory. And so the Institute for Creation Research in 1988, which is Morris's organization that he originated, came to realize this, and they admitted in a newsletter called Acts and Facts that a canopy producing only 3 feet of rain would result in sufficient energy to destroy all life on Earth. And of course, 3 feet of rain doesn't even come close to covering our highest mountains, right? We're talking about this, not even, it's a speck of, just a drop in the bucket compared to what would be needed to cover mountains that might be 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet high, right? So there's a serious scientific problem here with vapor canopy theory. So, and then the last problem we'll talk about really is that a substantial water vapor canopy above the Earth would prevent the inhabitants of Earth from actually seeing the celestial bodies, which God gave us to separate day and night and serve as signs for seasons and for days and years, as described in Genesis 1:14 through 18. So a vapor canopy would reflect and absorb or scatter most light trying to pass through it, so it would obscure our view of the sun and the moon and the stars. So that's directly in conflict with one of God's main intentions of why he put those heavenly bodies up there on day 4, right? So if we can't see them, it doesn't make any sense. So interestingly, Dr. Walt Brown, who was the originator of hydroplate theory, was one of the most outspoken critics of the vapor canopy theory. Again, Dr. Brown is just like amazing scientist. I mean, the man's like brilliant. And in seminars Dr. Brown gave, he frequently received questions about vapor canopy theories during the 1-hour question and answer sessions that concluded his creation seminars. And so between about 1981 and 1999, he conducted about 200 of these full-day seminars in the United States and in Canada. And Brown says of this, he says, "I never brought up the subject. I always tried to make my answer accurate but brief." This is when somebody brings up vapor canopy theory in these question and answer sessions. "I always tried to make my answer accurate but brief. I knew how explosive any opposition to the vapor canopy theory was. But in about half the seminars, someone in the audience would ask about it. I could see the crestfallen expressions on many in the audience when I laid out the problems with the canopy theory. I am sure that many people were calling ICR and reporting heresy among the creationist ranks." I mean, this is kind of what's going on here. Vapor canopy theory becomes so embedded, and there's so much writing on it. Now, Dr. Brown comes along and says, wait a minute, there's some real problems with this. Well, this causes a rift. This causes a problem, unfortunately. And you'd think that these people who are Christians would, hey, you've got a better theory, let's look at it. But unfortunately, you know, we're all humans, right? People, feelings get hurt, this sort of thing. And so remember, ICR's founder, Henry Morris, popularized this decades before. And so to expose the scientific flaws of vapor canopy theory in the 1980s was heresy. And perhaps some viewed it as an attack on Morris himself. And there was a pastor named Bob Enyart, unfortunately he's passed away. But he was a conservative radio talk show host and founder of what's called Real Science Radio, which is a great website. Just tons of scientific things that are fantastic. And they're big advocates of hydroplate theory. And he was a very outspoken advocate of hydroplate theory. So about this situation with Brown and Morris, Enyart said, broken relationships are hard to heal, even though they all now agree with him, with Dr. Brown. It led to hurt feelings. And he says these relationships are sometimes difficult to heal. And unfortunately, this led to repercussions that followed when Morris published a negative description of Dr. Brown and his leadership, because he used to be the head of the ICR, Dr. Brown was, or involved in it. And there was some misinformation given to him by a third party, by somebody else, who kind of lied, basically, about what was going on. And what followed from that was a dramatic drop in the demand for Dr. Brown to do seminars. People even began canceling seminars that they already had on the books, that they already had agreed to. And this caused a big problem. Dr. Brown then closed his office in Chicago, and he moved here to Phoenix to be here near his aging parents and considers what his next steps were. So Brown's fall into disfavor with ICR over vapor canopy theory seems to have encouraged additional unnecessary severe opposition from other creation scientists with competing flood explanations and gossip, unfortunately, from others. And 30 years later, the 4 largest creationist organizations and their followers still are largely opposed to hydroplate theory. Part of it probably is because these relationships haven't been healed. Part of it, I think, is when we talk about catastrophic plate tectonics, is that plate tectonics is the dominant theory right now for geology, talking about seafloor spreading and subduction of under the continents. And because of that being so embedded in our science today, in our geology, many will not even look at anything as competing. They'll automatically outright reject anything that opposes that. And Dr. Brown has also produced papers that, and in his book, that refute catastrophic plate tectonics. Or basically, plate tectonics catastrophic plate tectonics is plate tectonics sped up a lot faster to account for the shorter time frames. But they both have scientific problems, which we'll get into. In the words of one creation scientist, he said, yes, we probably should do more to advertise the death of the vapor canopy theory. If Henry Morris were alive today, I believe he would look at the facts and say it's time to abandon this and move on. But unfortunately, I think for maybe thousands or hundreds of thousands of people might think vapor canopy theory still explains the flood. They probably were taught it. They probably have never heard any scientific opposition to it. And they now still believe that it's a viable theory. Again, I don't know how many creationists may think this way, but there's still some out there that do. So in 2013, Dr. John Morris, who was the son of the late Dr. Henry Morris, and at the time he wrote this, he was the president of ICR. He said this, which is pretty telling here, to kind of look at human nature just a little bit. Talking of vapor canopy theory, he says, I still kind of hold to it. The geologic evidence doesn't support it. Scripture doesn't say it. I guess I'm not a real advocate, although I'd like for it to be true. Okay, so like other theories have been shown to be false, it just seems that some have so much invested into it that you just can't seem to walk away from it. We see this over and over again with the theory of evolution. When something is found to be false, or outright fakes or frauds, hey, people's careers are on the line, people's egos, and it shouldn't be this way, but that's human nature, right? And currently the pitfalls of the canopy model have grown to such an extent that most researchers have just abandoned it. But despite its association with Henry Morris, who is widely respected as the founder of the modern creation science movements, it's time to give it a very decent and public burial. We need to just dismiss this. So I want you to be aware of this. If you ever talk to anybody about this subject and they bring up vapor canopy theory, I think you need to be prepared to have an answer for this. Why it's not a scientifically viable flood model. So if we continue back now, we had a little detour there. We're going to continue back with our questions about the raqia, meaning either the Earth's atmosphere or a solid granite crust of the Earth formed during day 2 of creation. We come to question number 3. So Genesis 1:1 says that the heavens, or Shemayim, which I believe in proper context of verse 1, refers to the creation of physical space in our universe. In other words, Genesis 1:1 is truly a brilliant passage. I mean, you could spend, a tremendous amount of time just figuring out this one verse. It's just a short verse. It seems pretty simple, but there's so much behind it. It's just amazing. But this passage, basically, God is saying that there's a beginning. Okay? The universe is not eternal. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There is a beginning. And he creates the heavens, the physical space of the universe, and the earth, which in that context, the word is eretz, which can just mean matter. Basically, I think he's creating everything, the space and the matter that will be formed into the universe as we get a little further on into creation week. So if raqia always refers to the atmosphere or outer space, and Genesis 1:8 says the raqia or atmosphere or outer space was created on the second day, this is an obvious contradiction to verse 1. It says the heavens were created in verse 1 on day 1. If raqia means the outer space or physical space, then it's not created on both days, right? You can create it one of those 2 days. It's not created and then created again. It doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction here. And then if you continue in Genesis 1:9, it states, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place and let the dry land appear. This is on day 3. And this is obviously referring to the earth's water on the surface of the earth because of what happens on day 3 of creation. So this is describing day 3 now. If heaven meant atmosphere or outer space, and if the expanse meant a canopy surrounding the earth, Genesis wouldn't say that the waters were gathered in one place to allow dry land to appear. Wouldn't make any sense if the vapor canopy was far above the surface of the earth. Instead, this text reads, let the waters be below the heavens be gathered into one place. So the words of the heavens apparently were added to make it clear that these are the surface waters that are gathered into one place, which will then allow dry land to appear on day 3 of creation. We're going to discuss this process a little further as we get further into the hydroplate theory. But there's deformations in the crust due to gravity that will cause the crust to sink in certain places, allowing a place for the water to drain into basins, creating the pre-flood seas and allowing land to rise up out of the waters. And I think that's what's described on day 3. And again, there's some scientific aspects to this as well, which we'll get into. And then question 5, of course, says in Genesis 1:14, says the sun, the moon, and the stars, which fill the universe, were placed in the raqia of the heavens. In Genesis 1:7 says liquid water was placed above the raqia as opposed to the raqia of the heavens. So if it was placed above the raqia of the heavens, it means liquid water was out surrounding our universe. And that doesn't make any sense either. We've never seen that. It's important to realize that, as we discussed earlier, the phrase of the heavens being added changes the meaning of raqia. It's added in there. So Dr. Brown states in his book, after struggling to understand Genesis chapter 1, verse 8, especially for 30 years, he discovered several possible interpretations of this passage that would explain this, what's going on here. So in 2005, Dr. Brown states that he received independent letters from 2 different pastors proposing an explanation for this. So before Adam's fall, the earth basically was a paradise. In a sense, it was heaven on earth. Therefore, God called the expanse or firmament, which would be the earth's crust, he called it heaven. So each pastor provided a different biblical reason for his view, but both maintained that our difficulty in understanding Genesis 1:8 results largely from our inability to imagine this original paradise. We didn't live in that time. But pre-fall, if man had not fallen, this would have been paradise. This is described, it was perfection, right? We weren't going to die. There was no pain, no suffering. Sin hadn't happened at that time. That's paradise. This is basically heaven on earth. And that was what was originally intended. In this case, he's naming the earth's crust a place where his people and animals would be living on as they were created later on in the creation week. It's a perfect place that God has determined for us to live. So the 2 books involved in this basically, one is a book called Heaven, written by Randy Alcorn. This is a great book. It's a big read. It's quite a bit to it, and I admit I have not read all of it, but it's quite a bit of it. But it's a great book. His case is very detailed, and it's very strong arguments that he makes. So I can't attempt to even summarize it here. There's too much to it. But we can look at some of the important points as they relate to heaven as he brings up in the book. So as Alcorn points out, popular non-biblical stereotypes of heaven have crept into our Christian culture. And due to this, Dr. Brown believes that this accounts for much of our confusion over Genesis 1, chapter 8. In this confusion, it is this confusion that leads us to now interpret this as what the expanse is that God names the heavens in this passage. So Alcorn states that the earth was originally created with intention that it would be heaven. God created heaven since he is eternal and self-existent, therefore everything else is created. Heaven is described in Scripture as a place where God chooses to dwell. So thus before the fall, the earth was a paradise without sin and death. It was a heaven on earth. And we tend to think of heaven as a spiritual realm and not as a physical one due to much of how our culture defines it today. Right? But God dwells with man on the physical earth before the fall, and later chapters of Revelation state that there will be a new heaven and a new earth, and that will be God's dwelling place, where once again he will be among his people, and he will dwell with them again. So this is very significant here. This new earth will be a physical place, and we've been promised to have a resurrected body once again. We're going to live in a newly recreated earth, a physical place. Thus, God names the earth, the expanse, or the earth's crust, the raqia, heaven, because it happens before the fall of Genesis 3, when the dwelling place of God was with man, and he walked with Adam and Eve in the garden. And that's recorded in Genesis 3, chapter 8, or verse 8. It is at that time that they hide from God because they were afraid after they disobeyed him by eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which they were expressly told not to do, of course, in Genesis 3:1. Another excellent book that you might want to pick up, I don't know how easy this is to find, but is a book called Paradise, Past, Present, and Future. And it's written by a man named Diego Rodriguez. And in chapter 3 of this book, Rodriguez states that before we can go any further with the study of the past, present, and future states of heaven, it's necessary to ensure that we properly define heaven. In our English language, the word heaven can have several meanings depending on the context in which it's used. So Noah Webster, with Webster's dictionary, gave several definitions of the word in his original 1828 American Dictionary of the English language, and it included heaven among Christians. This is the part of space in which the omnipresent Jehovah is supposed to afford a more sensible manifestations of his glory. Hence, it's called the habitation of God, and is represented as the residence of angels and blessed spirits. In this sense, we must remember that while God is omnipresent, meaning he's everywhere, all at once, he does speak of a place that is unique habitation. And this place is called heaven. So since God is everywhere, and there's no place that we can say that God isn't, Rodriguez has thus given heaven the following definition. He says, heaven is best described as that unique place where God and his presence dwell openly with his creation. All things, whether physical or non-physical, were created by God. Therefore, wherever God chooses to very openly dwell in the midst of his creation can be called heaven. So heaven does not describe a place where God's presence is, but rather the specific place where God is uniquely present, where he is afforded, as Webster described, a more sensible manifestation of his glory. Heaven is the place that God is uniquely described being his habitation, even though he's omnipresent. So although God is everywhere at once, heaven is his unique habitation. It's unique. It can't be two places, like God can be. Heaven is not omnipresent, only God is. Even heaven itself is something that God created. So while God is immutable and everlasting, heaven is not. God can change and move heaven as he pleases, which is evident in the Word of God that he's changed it before the time of the fall, and he'll change it again back when Christ returns. And this is the thought that the paradise or heaven of the past was different. This is where, again, God chooses to dwell with his creation. And I know we're kind of right in the middle of this. I've got a little bit more to go, but I heard the bell. So we'll continue next week.